June 7, 1992, Springfield, Missouri. A summer night thick with the laughter of graduation parties. The kind of night where youth tastes invincible. But by dawn, the city awoke to a silence that has never lifted. 3 women, Sherrill Levitt, her daughter Suzie Streeter, and Suzie's best friend Stacy McCall, were gone, not lost on a highway, not seen fleeing into the dark, simply gone. Their purses, their keys, their cigarettes, even a family dog, left behind, like props on a stage after the actors vanished mid-scene. No broken glass, no screams, no trail to follow. Springfield began whispering that night, and 30 years later, the whispers haven't stopped. They call it the case of the Springfield Three. Police call it unsolved. Families call it torment. And the city, to this day, calls it cursed. It was supposed to be an ordinary June morning. Springfield, Missouri. Sunlight leaking through curtains. Birds rehearsing their tired summer chorus. But inside 1717, East Delmar Street, the silence had teeth. A coffee cup sat abandoned on the counter. Lipstick smudged in a half-forgotten hurry. Cigarettes rested in an ashtray, untouched, their smoke long since bled into stale air. A television hummed static in the background, like a machine trying to whisper the truth. 3 women, Suzie Streeter, her mother Sherrill Levitt, and Suzie's best friend Stacy McCall, had vanished into that silence. No broken window, no signs of struggle, just absence, as if the walls themselves had swallowed them whole. Police officers stepped into the neat suburban living room and felt something primal. The place didn't scream crime. It whispered erasure. Beds looked slept in. Makeup bags were unpacked. The dog was left behind, hungry and frantic. Whoever had been here hadn't just taken people. They carefully stitched over reality itself, leaving a room that looked both perfectly normal and profoundly wrong. Witnesses said they saw nothing unusual that night. Neighbors heard no screams, no crashes, no doors slammed in panic. The house didn't bleed or break. It just paused. Imagine pressing play on a VHS tape only to realize someone taped over the next 2 hours with blank gray fuzz. That's what happened to June 7th, 1992. And the cruelest detail? On the porch, a glass lamp had been shattered. An odd accident, almost too insignificant to matter. Friends who stopped by to check on the women swept it up, thinking they were being helpful. In that careless gesture, any fingerprints that might have spoken, the last fragile ghosts of the missing, were wiped clean. So here's where we begin. 3 women, last seen alive celebrating graduation, erased in a single night. No note, no ransom, no bodies, just a neat little house sitting in the center of town, like a stage set after the actors have left. And Springfield, a city that prided itself on safe streets and polite neighbors, suddenly discovered that monsters don't always leave claw marks. Sometimes they're invisible. The question that haunts every detail is brutally simple. How do 3 people vanish at once from their own home, without anyone seeing a thing? Springfield in 1992 wasn't the kind of place where you expected people to vanish. It wasn't Los Angeles with its neon underbelly or New York with its alleyway shadows. Springfield was middle America distilled, strip malls, church picnics, and teenagers driving circles around a Battlefield mall just to feel alive. The kind of city where lawn care mattered and doors were left unlocked because danger was something that lived elsewhere. Graduation weekend was buzzing with that particular electricity you only feel when you're 18 and staring down adulthood like it's some giant carnival ride. For Stacy McCall, blonde and bright-eyed, the night was a carousel of house parties, congratulatory hugs, and whispered plans for the future. Her best friend, Suzie Streeter, was just as full of restless energy, both of them set to spend the night at a friend's house after a long circuit of celebrations. Sherrill Levitt, Suzie's mother, was at home waiting, a hairstylist known for her steady hands and quiet warmth. She wasn't expecting danger either. She was probably expecting laundry, maybe phone calls, the ordinary rhythms that defined her world. But the Midwest is a strange duality. It wears a mask of calm while hiding a deep well of darkness. For every lemonade stand, there's a whispered story of someone who never came home. By the early 90s, true crime hadn't yet sunk its claws into daytime TV, and missing persons weren't constantly scrolling across cable news tickers. In Springfield, people trusted their neighbors. They trusted that if something happened in the night, someone would notice. The neighborhood where the three women lived looked like the American dream shrink-wrapped into cul-de-sacs and driveways. A single-story home with a porch lamp glowing faintly, a dog barking now and then, cars parked neatly in front. It wasn't the sort of stage you'd imagine for a mystery that would grip the nation. It was too ordinary. And yet, maybe that's why it still rattles the bones today. Because the Springfield Three didn't disappear from a back road or a dark alley. They didn't get swallowed in a big city crowd. They vanished from a home like millions of others, where dinner plates are stacked neatly, where family photos smile down from walls, where safety is supposed to be absolute. The world outside might have been celebrating new beginnings, but inside that small house, the story turned to endings no one could comprehend. The clock struck midnight, and Springfield's illusion of safety quietly cracked. The streets were still. The porch lamps glowed, and behind one of those doors, an impossible crime was writing itself into history. You can't tell this story without meeting the people who were erased from it, because they weren't just victims. They were vivid, alive, in the middle of becoming. Suzie Streeter was the spark plug. At 19, she had that defiant, rebellious streak familiar to anyone who's ever stood on the cliff edge of adulthood. Blonde hair, sharp wit, an edge that made her both magnetic and intimidating. Friends said she wasn't afraid to speak her mind, sometimes blunt, sometimes fiery, always unapologetically herself. There's a story about her once being asked if she was scared to live alone after graduation. She laughed. Scared? She wanted freedom more than anything. That answer now hangs in the air like irony sharpened into a blade. Stacy McCall, just 18, was a counterbalance, gentler, cautious, the kind of friend who smoothed over sharp corners. She'd been crowned most likely to brighten your day in high school, the kind of person who made others feel safe. Graduation night. She was the one reminding Suzie they had promised to stay over at another friend's house, try and keep things orderly. A natural peacemaker, a kid with her whole future spread in front of her like freshly fallen snow. And then there was Sherrill Levitt, 47 years old, Suzie's mother. A hairstylist who worked long hours, a woman who had raised her daughter largely on her own after divorce. Independent, practical, proud. The kind of mother who left lights on so her daughter and her friends wouldn't come home to a dark house. She was known for her generosity, for the way her clients felt more like friends. People trusted Sherrill because she made them feel seen. Together, the three women formed an unlikely triangle. The cautious daughter's friend, the fiery daughter herself, and the grounded mother. Their lives intersected at that house on East Elmar Street. A home that, until that night, had been nothing more than a shelter of routines and quiet normalcy. But what makes the Springfield Three stand out in the black sea of unsolved cases isn't just that they disappeared. It's that they disappeared together. Three women, across 3 generations, gone as though a single eraser swipe removed them from the page. When you look at their faces, the graduation gown Stacy never wore again, Suzie's mischievous grin, Sherrill's steady smile, you're reminded that the heart of this story isn't the void they left, but the lives they were still building. That's what makes the silence after their disappearance so unbearable. Because it isn't just silence, it's interruption. It began with the most ordinary of rites, high school graduation. June 6, 1992, the night every teenager in Springfield was bouncing between parties. Too wide to sleep, too restless to sit still. Stacy and Suzie drifted to the celebrations, their futures shimmering in front of them like heat waves on asphalt. They planned to crash at a friend's house, bodies exhausted but giddy. The way you do when you're young and convince the world can only expand. But plans dissolved easily at 2 in the morning. The house where they were supposed to stay became too crowded. Mattresses claimed, floors cluttered with sleeping bags. The girls decided, almost casually, to drive back to Suzie's home. It was a last-minute choice, the kind of decision that feels trivial at the time, but later carries the weight of fate itself. They pulled into 1717 East Del Mar, sometime around 2 a.m. Sherrill was likely already asleep, porch light flickering like a beacon. Maybe she stirred when she heard the door open. Maybe she got up to greet them. No one can say. What we do know is that by sunrise, no one could reach them. The first ripples of worry began small. Friends expecting Stacy and Suzie that morning tried calling the house. No answer. The phone just rang into the void. By midday, cars started pulling into the driveway. Friends, boyfriends, acquaintances, knocking on the door, letting themselves in. The house was unlocked. The dog was frantic. Inside, things looked strangely normal. Bed sheets were rumpled. Purses lined up in a neat row. Makeup bags left open on the counter. The little signs of women in motion interrupted mid-breath. And then the porch lamp, broken glass scattered across the steps. A friend swept it away, thinking they were helping, unaware that in that sweep they might have erased a single clue linking the outside world to what happened inside. No blood, no forced entry, no overturned furniture, just absence. Imagine a magician pulling a cloth off a table, leaving every glass upright, every plate intact. But the people are gone. That's the trick whoever did this managed to perform. By the time police were called, the house had been trampled by well-meaning friends and family. Fingerprints smudged, evidence compromised, time slipping like water through their hands. The first disturbance wasn't just a disappearance. It was a subtle way reality had been rearranged, a domestic space turned uncanny. 3 lives cut off mid-sentence. And Springfield had no idea it had just stepped into a story with no ending. The first hours after a disappearance are supposed to be frantic, a rush of urgency. But in Springfield, the case of the 3 women slid immediately into something stranger, something that felt more like fog than fire. The house didn't scream of violence. It hummed with contradiction. The purses were there, lined up neatly, as if each woman had set hers down in some subconscious synchrony. Keys, cigarettes, money, still waiting. Who leaves behind everything they need to function in the world? It was as if they had stepped out for a moment, only they never returned. And then the phone calls. Friends swore that when they tried dialing the house, they got strange, unsettling answers. One friend reported a man's mocking voice on the other end, followed by laughter. Was it a cruel prankster who had heard about the disappearance, or something more sinister? Police dismissed it as coincidence, but try telling that to someone whose best friend has just vanished into air. There was also the dog, Cinnamon, a small Yorkshire Terrier, found pacing the house, nervous, distressed. Dogs don't lie. They remember what they see. And Cinnamon was a witness without words. Had she barked? Had she watched strangers enter the house? Or was she too familiar with whoever came through that door? Neighbors later admitted hearing nothing unusual that night. No car doors slamming, no shouts, no glass breaking, except for that lamp on the porch. It was almost surgical, the way these women were removed. No noise, no mess, just subtraction. And while investigators scrambled for leads, Springfield itself began to fracture. Rumors crawled through diners, schools, beauty salons. Maybe it was a stalker. Maybe it was someone they knew. Maybe the women had left on their own, though nothing about the scene made sense with that story. The theories began to pile on top of each other, like unstable bricks, none of them strong enough to hold the weight of the truth. It's at this point the case began to feel cursed. Evidence handled poorly. A crime scene already contaminated. Leads opening only to collapse. And the sickest part? The longer people searched, the more the house itself began to feel like a taunt. 3 women gone, a dog left behind, and every ordinary object whispering that something unordinary had happened here. Springfield wanted answers, but what it got was a deepening silence, an uncanny void where 3 lives had once been. The police called it challenging. That's a polite way of saying we were fumbling in the dark, chasing shadows, and every time we reached out, our hands closed on nothing. Investigators combed through the house, but the scene was already compromised. Well-meaning friends had walked in and out, tidied up, answered the phone, swept glass away. By the time detectives tried to reconstruct events, it was like trying to assemble a puzzle where half the pieces had been thrown into a storm drain. Still, theories began to bloom like weeds. One centered on the idea of a home invasion, a stranger slipping through an unlocked door in the early hours, forcing the women to comply. But where were the signs of struggle? Even a quiet abduction leaves ripples. Knocked over chairs, scattered belongings. Here, there was nothing but stillness. Another theory, darker, more insidious, suggested someone they knew had entered the house. A familiar face that disarmed suspicion, a voice that didn't trigger alarm. That would explain why Cinnamon, the dog, hadn't raised a neighborhood with frantic barking. Pets don't react the same way to friends. Then came whispers of a connection to local men, Dustin Recklaw and Michael Clay, acquaintances with criminal ties. People wondered if they had crossed paths with Suzie or Stacy that night. Leads flared and fizzled, without evidence. Police could only circle their names, unable to pin anything down. And, of course, the darker possibility that the women were targeted not randomly but deliberately. Suzie had been set to testify in a case involving stolen property, tied to her ex-boyfriend. Some speculated that this wasn't coincidence, that maybe silence had been enforced violently and permanently. The investigators brought in cadaver dogs, scoured fields, drained ponds. They pulled tips from psychics and sifted through hundreds of supposed sightings. The case drew in the FBI, the Missouri Highway Patrol, local law enforcement, a circus of badges and theories. And yet, for all the manpower, the Springfield Three refused to reappear. The cruel irony? Each new lead only deepened the uncertainty. A van was reported circling the neighborhood. A strange man was spotted watching graduation parties. A scream was allegedly heard miles away. Every rumor felt urgent in the moment, only to dissolve under scrutiny. Theories multiplied faster than facts. And somewhere in the middle of it, the families were left pacing their own hallways, wondering if the truth was already slipping through everyone's fingers. Because the investigation wasn't just a hunt for answers, it was a slow disintegration of certainty itself. Here's the cruel twist. Every time the investigation seemed poised to break open, it collapsed under its own weight. Springfield was a city gnawing at its fingernails, desperate for clarity. But what it got was a theater of false starts. The most infamous lead came in 1993, when a man named Robert Craig Cox entered the frame. A convicted kidnapper with a history darker than any urban legend, Cox was already serving time in Texas. He'd once lived in Springfield. He admitted to knowing the area. And when asked about the Springfield Three, his answers weren't just suspicious. They were sinister. He claimed he knew they were dead. He even implied their bodies would never be found. But here's the breakdown. Cox refused to elaborate. He dropped hints like breadcrumbs, only to sweep them away with smug silence. "You'll never recover the bodies," he told reporters, as if enjoying the power of withholding. Police interrogated him, dug into his background, tried to pry loose even one detail that could crack the case. Nothing. It was like trying to extract water from a stone that enjoyed watching you thirst. And then came the cement theory. Years later, rumors spread that the women might be buried under a hospital parking garage poured shortly after their disappearance. Cadaver dogs reportedly alerted to certain spots. Radar scans showed anomalies underground. For a brief, electric moment, hope surged. Maybe the mystery had been hiding in plain sight, under concrete all along. But bureaucracy strangled the momentum. The hospital refused excavation without compelling evidence, and the scans were deemed inconclusive. Once again, silence filled the void where answers should have been. This was a turning point not because of new discoveries, but because of psychological collapse. Families who had once clung to hope began to fray. Detectives privately admitted they felt cursed. Media descended, turning the story into spectacle, feeding Springfield's collective paranoia. Suddenly, every van looked suspicious. Every neighbor seemed complicit. Every whisper carried the weight of accusation. The real breakdown wasn't just procedural. It was human. Trust eroded. Families felt the police had failed them. Police felt the public was drowning them in half-truths. Springfield turned inward, eating its own certainty until nothing was left but doubt. And through it all, that house on East Del Mar sat quietly, its walls still holding secrets no one could pry open. Here's the truth. There is no resolution. Not in the way we crave. Anyway, there are only fractures, theories piled like bones, and questions that sit heavy on the chest 3 decades later. Did Robert Craig Cox really know what happened? Or was he just a parasite feeding off grief, performing menace because it made him feel powerful? If the women were buried under that hospital parking lot, why was the excavation never approved? Did Springfield prioritize convenience over closure? And what about the phone call? A man laughing on the line when one of the missing women's friends dialed. Was it some cruel coincidence, or the killer mocking them in real time? These aren't loose ends. They're open wounds. The most chilling question is the simplest. How do 3 people vanish together from a suburban house without leaving a ripple of sound or evidence? 1 person missing, that's tragedy. 2 people missing, that's bizarre. 3? That's an erasure. So precise it feels like choreography. Whoever did this wasn't sloppy. They were deliberate. They knew how to control the scene, how to remove people without tipping the neighborhood off. That's not random. That's practice. And yet, no bodies. No confession that stuck. No DNA trail leading back to a door. Just 30-plus years of silence. The women's families were forced to live in the purgatory of not knowing if they were alive, suffering, gone, or buried under layers of Missouri soil. Imagine living every day with a doorbell as both hope and terror. The official record lists the Springfield Three as missing persons. No charges, no closure, just a file thick with dead ends. For law enforcement, it remains one of the most haunting cold cases in American history. For Springfield, it's a story that cracked their illusion of safety forever. The lingering question isn't just who took them, it's how do you live in a city that can erase 3 women overnight and never cough up the truth? Springfield never shook it off. You don't just misplace 3 women and go back to mowing your lawn like nothing happened. The disappearance of Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy settled over the city like a permanent storm cloud, unseen but always there, crackling just behind the horizon. For the families, life split into 2 eras. Before June 7, 1992, and after, birthdays became markers of absence. Holidays became rituals of pretending. wrapping empty chairs with forced smiles. Cheryl's relatives kept her beauty salon chair empty for months, like she might walk back in, scissors in hand. Stacy's siblings grew older while her photograph remained trapped at 18, her smile frozen in time. Susie's friends drifted into adulthood, carrying the guilt of having been at those graduation parties, knowing that if the night had unfolded differently, maybe they would be the ones still here. For Springfield itself, the case rewired the city's DNA. Parents stopped leaving doors unlocked. Kids who once roamed freely were suddenly leashed by curfews. The case lodged itself in every conversation like a splinter. What if it happens again? It changed the way the community thought about safety, about trust, about neighbors. Nationally, the Springfield Three became a grim reference point in law enforcement training manuals. The case where everything went wrong. Contaminated crime scene. Lost evidence. Overlooked leads. The mistakes are still dissected in classrooms. A cautionary tale of how a case can collapse before it even begins. But legacy isn't just procedural. It's cultural. The story has become folklore in Missouri, retold with campfire dread. Documentaries, podcasts, true crime forums. They all circle back to East Delmar Street like moths to a porch light. And each retelling keeps the women alive in a strange way, even as it confirms their absence. Some legacies are medals. Others are shadows. The Springfield Three live on as a ladder. A shadow that reshaped the city. A shadow that whispers through police departments across the country. A shadow that asks a question too heavy for silence, but too unanswered for peace. And maybe that's the worst legacy of all. Not knowing if the end has already been written, or if it's still out there waiting. Picture it. 3 women, gone from a neat little house in the center of a quiet Missouri city. No bodies, no sounds, no trace. 30 years later, their faces are still stapled to memory boards, still printed in articles, still lingering in late-night whispers. It's not just a case anymore. It's folklore. Mid-dressed in denim and hairspray, forever 18, forever missing. And here's the cruel poetry of it all. The Springfield Three became more famous for their absence than they ever would have been for their presence. That's what mysteries do. They chew up lives and spit them back out as symbols. Sherrill isn't just a mother anymore. She's the archetype of maternal devotion swallowed by the void. Suzie isn't just a fiery teenager. She's the eternal rebel, punished not for her choices, but for someone else's. Stacy isn't just a girl next door. She's every dream deferred, every bright future stolen in a whisper. We're left with questions that rot instead of fade. Was a neighbor smiling across the fence? A stranger passing through on graduation night? A monster with a plan so perfect it left no scar? Or was it, as some whisper with grim certainty, an answer already buried under concrete, waiting for someone to care enough to dig? The silence of this case is louder than any resolution could ever be. It forces us to admit that sometimes the world doesn't give you endings. Sometimes it just takes and leaves you standing in the wreckage of unanswered questions. And maybe that's the part that haunts. Not that 3 women vanished, but that we still live in a world where erasure can happen without a sound, without a trace, without consequence. The house on East Delmar is gone now. Torn down in 1997, as if the city itself couldn't bear to keep staring at the wound. But emptiness doesn't erase history. Grass grows where the foundation once stood. Children ride bikes past it, and somewhere in the shadows of Springfield, the truth waits. 30 years on, the case remains unsolved. And perhaps the most chilling thought is this. The person responsible could still be out there, blending into ordinary life, walking past porch lights, smiling politely, carrying a secret that has outlived decades. The Springfield Three are not just missing. They are a reminder, etched into the American psyche, that disappearance is sometimes more permanent, more terrifying than death itself. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.